You'll notice something interesting if you pay close attention to how most people give compliments. They orbit around the obvious: beauty, style, a smile. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with appreciating those things, they are the lowest level of perception. They require no effort, no depth, no real awareness. Anyone can say, "You look nice." It costs nothing, and because it costs nothing, it's often worth nothing. Now contrast that with a different kind of compliment, one that doesn't land on the surface, but instead reaches beneath it. When you say to a woman, "I respect how you think," you are doing something very few people ever do. You are acknowledging her internal world, her reasoning, her judgment, her perspective, and that changes everything. Because here's the truth most people ignore: attraction that lasts is rarely built on appearance alone. It's built on being seen, not glanced at, seen. There's a psychological shift that happens when someone feels understood at the level of their thoughts. It creates a sense of validation that is far more powerful than admiration of looks. Looks are visible to everyone. But the way someone thinks, that requires attention, that requires presence, and presence is rare. When you compliment the mind, you're signaling something deeper about yourself as well. You're saying, without explicitly stating it, that you are not desperate for surface level approval. You're not chasing what everyone else is chasing. You're operating on a different frequency, one that values substance over spectacle. That alone creates a form of quiet authority. But let's be precise here, because this is where most people get it wrong. This is not about throwing out intellectual, sounding compliments in the hope that they'll impress. People can sense performance. They can feel when something is rehearsed or manipulative. The power of this compliment lies in its authenticity. It has to come from genuine observation. Maybe she expresses an opinion in a way that's unusually clear. Maybe she handles a difficult situation with calm logic instead of emotional chaos. Maybe she asks questions that reveal depth and curiosity. These are the moments you pay attention to. These are the moments you speak on. And when you do, you don't overcomplicate it. You don't turn it into a speech. You simply say, "I like the way you think about things," or "That's a sharp way of looking at it," direct. Calm, certain. Notice the tone here. It's not needy. It's not seeking approval in return. It's an observation, not a transaction. Psychologically, this taps into something very powerful. Most people, especially women who are used to being complimented on appearance, are conditioned to expect a certain type of interaction. When you break that pattern, you create intrigue. You stand out, not because you're trying to, but because you're not following the script. And beyond intrigue, you build respect. Respect is the foundation that most people skip. They chase attraction, excitement, validation. But without respect, those things are unstable. When you show that you value someone's mind, you're building something far more durable. You're saying, "I'm not just here for what's easy to see, I'm here for what actually matters." There's also a philosophical layer to this. When you choose to compliment the mind, you're aligning yourself with a deeper principle, that a person's worth is not defined by how they appear, but by how they perceive, interpret, and navigate the world. That's a rare stance in a culture that constantly prioritizes the external, and people feel that difference, even if they can't immediately articulate it. But here's the part that requires honesty. You can't fake this if you don't actually value it. If you're still primarily focused on surface-level attraction, your words will eventually expose you. This only works when it reflects a genuine shift in what you pay attention to. You have to train yourself to notice how people think, how they respond, how they process reality. That's where the real transformation happens, not just in how others see you, but in how you see others. Because once you start valuing the mind, your entire standard changes. You become less impressed by appearances and more drawn to depth. And ironically, that makes you more attractive, not because you're trying to be, but because you're no longer operating from the same shallow framework as everyone else. So, when you tell a woman, I respect how you think, understand what you're really communicating, you're not just giving a compliment. You're offering recognition at a level most people never reach. You're separating yourself from the noise of predictable, forgettable interactions. And that's what makes it powerful, because in a world where everyone is looking, very few are actually seeing. And the person who learns to see clearly will always leave the deepest impression. Once you move beyond surface level compliments and begin to recognize the value of someone's mind, the next shift becomes even more subtle, but arguably more powerful. It's the ability to see what makes someone distinct and to name it with precision. Because here's the reality: almost everyone wants to feel special, but very few people feel genuinely understood. There's a difference. Special has become a diluted word, overused, exaggerated, often empty, but being seen as different in a real, specific way. That touches something much deeper. When you say, you're different and I mean that, it only works if you actually know why. This is where awareness separates itself from performance. Most people rely on generic praise because it's easy. It doesn't require attention, memory, or thought, but specificity demands that you slow down and observe. Not just what someone looks like, but how they move through the world, how they respond under pressure, what they prioritize, what they ignore, what they tolerate, and what they don't. Difference lives in those details. Maybe she doesn't seek validation the way others do. Maybe she listens more than she speaks, but when she does speak, it carries weight. Maybe there's a calmness in her that isn't passive, but controlled, intentional. Or maybe it's the opposite, a kind of energy that's expressive but not chaotic, confident but not loud. These are distinctions, and when you recognize them, you're doing something most people never take the time to do. You're paying attention without an agenda, and that's rare. Psychologically, this kind of compliment creates a very specific reaction. It introduces curiosity. When someone hears you're different, the immediate question is how, and that moment matters. Because now, you're not just giving validation, you're inviting reflection. You're making them see themselves through a lens they may not have considered. But this only works if you follow through with clarity. If your explanation is vague, the impact disappears. If you say, you're just different, without substance, it feels hollow. But when you anchor it in something real, you don't react the way most people do. You actually think before you respond. Now it lands. Now it becomes memorable. And memorability is everything. People don't remember every compliment they receive. They remember the ones that felt accurate, the ones that revealed something true about them, the ones that made them pause, even for a second, and think, that's actually right. That's the level you're operating on here. But there's another layer to this that often goes unnoticed. When you highlight someone's uniqueness, you're also demonstrating discernment. You're showing that you don't see everyone the same way, that you're not handing out identical praise to different people, that your attention is selective. And selectivity creates value. If you treat everyone as interchangeable, your words lose weight. But when it's clear that you notice differences, that you evaluate, that you think, that you distinguish, then what you say carries more significance. This is where confidence subtly enters the equation, because to point out someone's uniqueness without exaggeration, without trying to impress, requires a certain level of internal stability. You're not overcompensating, you're not seeking approval, you're simply stating what you observe, calmly, directly, without pressure, and that tone is important. There's no need to dramatize it, no need to make it overly emotional or intense. In fact, the more grounded you are, the more believable it becomes. You're different doesn't need to sound like a line, it should sound like a conclusion. Something you arrived at after paying attention. Now, let's address the mistake people often make here. They try to manufacture uniqueness. They exaggerate small traits into something larger than they are, thinking it will make the compliment more impactful. But overstatement does the opposite. It breaks trust. People can sense when something is inflated. Authenticity isn't about making something sound impressive. It's about making something true feel recognized, and truth doesn't need decoration. There's also a philosophical dimension to this idea of difference. In a world that constantly pressures people to conform, to fit into expectations, trends, roles, being seen as different in a positive, grounded way is deeply affirming. It suggests that who they are naturally without adjustment already holds value. That's powerful. Because you're not asking them to change, you're not rewarding them for performing, you're acknowledging them as they are. And that kind of recognition creates a quiet sense of connection, not because it's loud or dramatic, but because it feels real. Over time, this approach reshapes how people experience you. You become someone who notices what others overlook, someone who speaks with intention instead of habit, someone whose words don't blend into the background. And that's where influence begins, not in volume, but in precision. So when you say, "You're different," and I mean that, understand what you're actually doing. You're identifying something specific, something real, and reflecting it back with clarity. You're offering a perspective that isn't borrowed or generic, but earned through attention. And in a world full of noise, the person who can recognize and articulate what makes someone truly distinct will always stand apart. Because people don't remember who said the most. They remember who saw the most. And once you've reached that level, where you're no longer focused on appearances alone, and you've trained yourself to recognize what makes someone genuinely distinct, the final shift is the one that separates attention from attachment and attraction from respect. It's subtle, but it changes the entire dynamic. Most people, when they compliment someone, do it from a position of emotional dependence. They say things like, "You make me happy," or "I feel good when I'm around you," or "You're the only one who understands me." And on the surface, those statements sound positive. They sound affectionate, but if you look closer, they reveal something else. They place the other person at the center of your emotional stability. And that's where the imbalance begins, because when your compliments are rooted in what someone does for you rather than who they are, you're not expressing appreciation, you're expressing reliance. You're saying indirectly, "My experience depends on you." And while that might feel flattering in the short term, over time it creates pressure. It shifts the interaction from mutual interest to emotional responsibility. People don't respect what feels dependent. They may respond to it, they may even enjoy it briefly, but they don't anchor themselves to it. This is why the shift matters. When you say, "I like who you are, not just how you make me feel," you're doing something fundamentally different. You're removing yourself from the center of the statement. You're not talking about your emotions, you're recognizing their identity, their values, their way of being, and that communicates stability. It shows that you are not easily moved, not easily swayed, not dependent on external validation to regulate your internal state. You're grounded enough to observe someone without needing them to complete you. That's where respect begins. Psychologically, this creates a very different experience. Instead of feeling like they have to maintain your feelings, the other person feels seen without pressure. They're not being evaluated based on how well they satisfy your needs. They're being recognized for qualities that exist independently of you. That distinction is critical because when someone feels like they're constantly responsible for your emotional state, it becomes exhausting. But when they feel appreciated for who they are at their core, it becomes freeing. It allows space for genuine connection rather than obligation. And there's also a deeper layer to this one that most people overlook. When you focus on who someone is rather than how they make you feel, you're revealing your own standards. You're showing that you evaluate people based on character, not convenience, that you value consistency, integrity, and self-awareness over temporary emotional highs. That's not common. Most people are driven by feeling. If it feels good, they attach. If it feels bad, they withdraw. But that kind of emotional reactivity leads to unstable connections because feelings are fluid, they change. They fluctuate, they're influenced by mood, environment, timing. Character, on the other hand, is far more stable. So when your compliments are rooted in character, I respect your discipline, I admire your honesty, I like how you stay calm under pressure. You're anchoring your perception in something that doesn't shift easily, and that creates a sense of depth. It also positions you differently. You're no longer just someone who reacts. You become someone who evaluates, someone who observes patterns, not just moments. And that level of awareness naturally commands more respect because it suggests that your attention isn't automatic, it's earned. Now, this doesn't mean you suppress emotion or avoid expressing how someone affects you. That's not the point. The point is balance. If every compliment you give is centered around your feelings, it starts to sound self-focused. But when you shift toward recognizing the other person's identity, you create a more grounded and mature interaction. And maturity in this context is incredibly attractive, not because it's loud or dramatic, but because it's rare. There's also a quiet confidence embedded in this approach. You're not trying to impress, you're not trying to secure a reaction. You're simply stating what you see based on your own internal Arabic, Meme Arabic, Tain Arabic, Farsi Ye Arabic, Halif Arabic, Rat, your own standard, and that makes your words more credible. Because they're not driven by need, they're driven by clarity, and clarity is powerful. It cuts through the noise of exaggerated compliments and emotional overexpression. It creates a sense of calm authority, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but naturally holds it. Over time, this changes how people respond to you. They begin to take your words more seriously because they're not given freely or carelessly. When you express appreciation, it feels considered, intentional, real, and that's where impact lies, not in how often you speak, but in how accurately you see. So, when you tell someone, I like who you are, understand what you're really communicating. You're saying, I see your foundation, not just your effect. You're separating their identity from your emotion, and in doing so, you're creating space for something more stable than attraction alone. You're creating respect, and without respect, attraction fades. It becomes inconsistent, unpredictable, easily replaced. But when respect is present, attraction deepens. It becomes rooted, not reactive. That's the difference. So as you move forward, pay attention to the way you express appreciation. Ask yourself whether your words are centered on dependency or discernment. Whether you're reacting to how someone makes you feel or recognizing who they actually are. Because the shift is small, but the impact is not. And in the end, the people who leave the strongest impression are not the ones who feel the most. They're the ones who see the clearest and choose with intention.